During the month of Lent, what we are doing is listening and hearing the entire Gospel of Mark over the 6 weeks of Lent, ending on Easter Sunday with Mark 16. So we begin this week with reading about Jesus preaching in Galilee. This week, Robin is Jesus, Carol is the narrator, Fred will be our commentator from a distance, and we have our character actors.
Jesus went out among the villages teaching, and he called the 12 to him and began to send them out in pairs. He gave them authority over unclean spirits and instructed them to take nothing with them but a staff. No money, no bag, nothing but the sandals on their feet and a coat on their back. When you go into a house, stay there until it is time for you to leave that town. And if someone will not accept you and your message, when you leave, shake off the dust of that place from your feet as a judgment against it. On the day of judgment, that city will wish for the punishment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And so his disciples went out into the countryside, preaching the changed life as Jesus had taught them, casting out unclean spirits and anointing the sick with oil to heal them. Jesus had become so well known that King Herod received reports of all that Jesus was doing. Some were saying that John the Baptist had been raised from the dead, and that these mighty works were the fruits of his resurrection.
No, this Jesus is Elijah, returned to work on the earth.
And still others said he was another of the prophets.
No, it is John, the prophet I beheaded, risen from the dead.
For the blood of John was on his hands. Herod had imprisoned John in the days before Jesus began his teaching. John had preached to Herod that he should not have married his own brother's wife, Herodias. For so it is written in the Hebrew Scriptures, it is not lawful for one to marry his brother's wife. Herodias held a grudge against John and would have had him killed, but she couldn't. Herod feared John as a holy and righteous man and did what he could to protect him. John taught hard truths, and yet Herod found he usually liked hearing them. So Herod had put John in prison instead of executing him. And there John sat until Herod's birthday, when the governor held a great state dinner. That night, Herod's stepdaughter danced beautifully for the state officials, and the king proclaimed a solemn vow in the presence of his honored guests, military officers, and some of the leading men of Galilee.
Ask me whatever you wish, and I will grant it. Whatever you want, I will give to you up to half my province.
She went out and consulted with her mother, Herodias, who had only one great desire, and told her daughter what she must say.
I want the head of John the Baptist right now, delivered to me on a platter.
Herod was horrified, but he had sworn an oath and could not break his word in front of his invited guests. So immediately he sent an executioner to the prison to behead John and bring them the head. It was brought to the girl upon a platter, and she took it to her mother. When John's disciples were told of this, they came for his body and gave it a proper burial. Now the 12 returned from their travels and told him what they had done, whom they had seen, and how they had spread the news of God's kingdom. Let us go out into the wilderness for a while and rest ourselves. The crowds gathered as always, and Jesus and the 12 couldn't eat because so many people came and went. They could get no peace until they boarded a boat and sailed to a deserted place. But the people would not be put off so easily. Those along the shore who recognized Jesus followed a lone coast. People pushed out of all the cities and gathered ahead of him, so that when Jesus came ashore and saw this crowd of people waiting for him in a place that should have been relatively deserted, he was moved with compassion. They were like sheep without a shepherd. He began to teach them many things as the day passed. At last, the disciples came to Jesus.
It is getting late and there is nothing around for miles. Send these people to the surrounding villages so they can buy something to eat.
Why don't you give them something to eat?
What? It would cost a fortune to buy bread for these people.
Does anyone have any bread? Go and see.
There are 5 pieces of flatbread and 2 fish, if that makes any difference.
Listen, tell them to gather in smaller groups and sit on that green patch of grass. And so the disciples gathered the people in groups of 100 or of 50, and they sat down. Jesus took the 5 pieces of flatbread and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, thanked God for the food, and broke it. He gave the pieces to the disciples to distribute, and all of the people ate until no one was hungry. Then they gathered 12 baskets full of leftovers. That day, 5,000 men ate their fill of the bread when Jesus fed the hungry crowd.
The disciples pulled Jesus aside to point out the obvious. Everyone needs to go and eat something. But Jesus, as usual, isn't about to be distracted by the obvious. His answer must irritate them even further. Why don't you give them something to eat? Jesus is seeing a much bigger reality. He is deliberately creating a turning point in his ministry. He wants to make them a part of his miracles. From recorders and observers, they will become participants. And so the disciples, not Jesus, tell the people to sit down, pass out the food, and collect the leftovers after everyone has eaten until they are stuffed. The disciples must feel pretty sheepish as they experience how Jesus is making them a part of the miracle, despite their mundane concerns and their frustrations with him.
Not long after, he sent his disciples out onto their boat to sail to Bethsaida on the other shore, and he sent the crowd away. After everyone had gone, he slipped away to pray on a mountain overlooking the sea. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. He saw that his disciples were making little progress because they were rowing against a stiff wind. Before daylight, he came near them, walking on the water, and would have passed by them. Some of them saw him walking on the surface of the water, thought he was a ghost, and cried out. When they all saw him, they were terrified. Don't be frightened. Do you see? It's I. He walked across the water to the boat, and as soon as he stepped aboard, the contrary wind ceased its blowing. They were greatly astonished. Although they had just witnessed the miracle of Jesus feeding 5,000 with bread and fish, and other signs besides, they didn't understand what it all meant, and their hearts remained hard.
How can the disciples still be in doubt about Jesus after having been part of so many miracles? Like the Israelites in the Old Testament, the disciples are discovering the truth that miracles don't produce faith. As Jesus so often points out, the process works the other way around. It's faith that produces miracles. Miracles are only signs, evidence of truth that you have to know before the miracle. As long as the disciples are still in doubt about who Jesus is, they find their faith constantly challenged and frequently wavering. It will not be until after the resurrection, the greatest miracle of all, that they will come to recognize and believe in Jesus for who he is, and then their hearts will at last open.
When they finished their journey, they landed the boat in Gennesaret. People at once recognized Jesus as the healer. Immediately, they hurried to collect the sick and infirm, bringing them to him in beds if they had to, laying them out in the markets of any village, city, or field where he might pass.
Just let us touch the fringe of your robe.
Even the people who touched only it were made whole again. Then the Pharisees returned to talk with Jesus, and with them came some of the scribes and scholars from Jerusalem.
Your disciples are eating bread with defiled, unwashed hands.
Now you need to know that the Pharisees, and all Jews for that matter, held the tradition of their ancestors that hands must be washed before eating to avoid being ritually unclean. Likewise, they washed when they returned from the market and followed similar purity teachings as well, from the washing of their food to the washing of their bowls, cups, and kettles.
Why don't your disciples follow the traditions passed down to us? Why do they eat their bread with defiled hands?
Isaiah prophesies wisely about your religious pretensions when he wrote, "These people honor me with words off their lips. Meanwhile, their hearts are far from me. Their worship is empty, void of true devotion. They teach a human commandment, memorized and practiced by rote." When you cling blindly to your own traditions, such as washing utensils and cups, you completely miss God's command. Then indeed you have perfected setting aside God's commands for the sake of your tradition. Moses gave you God's commandment, honor your father and your mother. And also, if you curse your father or your mother, you will be put to death. But you say to your aged parents, I've decided that the support you were expecting from me will now be the holy offering set aside for God. After that, he is not allowed to do anything for his parents. Do you think God wants you to honor your traditions that you have passed down? This is only one of many places where you are blind. To the crowd that had gathered, listen, all of you, to this teaching. I want you to understand there is nothing outside someone that can corrupt him. Only the things that come out of a person can corrupt him. All who have ears to hear, let them listen.
When they had come in from the road, his disciples asked him what he meant by this teaching.
Do you mean you don't understand this one either? Whatever goes into people from outside can't defile them, because it doesn't go into their hearts. Outside things go through their guts and back out, thus making all foods pure. No, it's what comes from within that corrupts. It's what grows out of the hearts of people that leads to corruption. Evil thoughts, immoral sex, theft, murder, adultery, greed, wicked acts, bribery, sensuality, jealousy, slander, pride, and foolishness. All of these come from within, and these are the sins of a truly corrupt person.
Although Mark specifically states that Jesus is overriding the Old Testament dietary laws and declaring all foods pure, it will be a long time before the disciples are willing to act on that message. One of the biggest controversies in the early church will be the question of dietary restrictions and how the Old Testament laws ought to be observed by Jewish and non-Jewish Christian believers. However, Jesus makes it clear in this passage that his main concern has nothing to do with what people eat. Instead, he is concerned about the hearts of his followers.
From there, Jesus and his followers traveled to the region of Tyre and Sidon on the Mediterranean coast. He hoped to slip unnoticed into a house, but people discovered his presence. Shortly after he arrived, a woman whose daughter was filled with an unclean spirit heard that he was there, so she came directly to him and prostrated herself at his feet. The woman was not a Jew, but a Syro-Phoenician, a Greek by birth. All the same, she came to Jesus and begged him to cast the unclean spirit out of her daughter.
I must feed children first. It would do no good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs.
Yes, Lord. But even the dogs under the table must eat the crumbs of the children.
This is a wise saying. Go back home. Your daughter is free of the spirit that troubled her.
And when she returned to her house, she discovered that it was as Jesus had told her. Her daughter lay on her bed, in her right mind, whole and healthy.
Although Jesus first answers the Greek woman harshly, he ultimately responds to her request by healing her daughter. He demonstrates that God's loving presence has come to all people and not just the Jews. It is one of the first glimpses in the gospel of the truth that will become clear later. The truth that through Jesus, God is making all people, and not just one chosen nation, clean and whole.
Jesus traveled on his way through Tyre and Sidon, eventually returning to the region of the Sea of Galilee. From there, he passed on to the area of the 10 cities. Among the sick who were brought to him was a man who was deaf and could barely speak at all. And those who brought him begged Jesus to lay his hands on the man. Jesus took him aside from the crowd, alone, and touched his ears with his fingers. Then, after spitting on his fingers, Jesus touched the man's tongue. Looking heavenward to God, Jesus sighed and commanded,
Open up and let this man speak.
Immediately the man could hear. His tongue was loosed, and he spoke plainly. Jesus ordered those who had witnessed this to tell no one, but the more he insisted, the more zealously people spread the word.
He does everything so well. He even returns sound to the deaf and dumb.
Once again, a huge crowd had followed them, and they had nothing to eat. So Jesus called his disciples together.
These people have been with me for 3 days without food. They're hungry, and I am concerned for them. If I try to send them home now, they'll faint along the way, because many of them have come a long, long way to hear and see me.
Where can we find enough bread for these people in this desolate place?
How much bread do we have left?
7 rounds of flatbread.
So, as before, he commanded the people to sit down, and he took the rounds of flatbread, gave thanks for them, and broke them. His disciples took what he gave them and fed the people. They also had a few small fish, which, after he'd spoken the blessing, he likewise gave his followers to pass to the people. When all had eaten their fill, and they had gathered up the food that remained, 7 baskets were full. On this occasion, there were about 4,000 people who had eaten the food that Jesus provided. Jesus sent the crowd home. Then immediately he got into a boat with his disciples and sailed away. Upon their arrival in Dalmanutha, in the district of Magdala, they were met by Pharisees, ready with their questions and tests, seeking some sign from heaven that his teaching was from God.
Why does this generation ask for a sign before they will believe? Believe me when I say that you will not see one.
He left the Pharisees and sailed across to the other shore. The disciples had forgotten to buy provisions, so they had only 1 round of flatbread among them. Jesus took this moment to warn them.
Beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod.
The disciples didn't understand what Jesus was talking about and discussed it among themselves.
What?
He's saying this because we've run out of bread.
Why are you focusing on bread? Don't you see yet? Don't you understand? You have eyes. Why don't you see? You have ears. Why don't you hear? Are you so hard-hearted? Don't you remember when I broke the 5 rounds of flatbread among the 5,000? Tell me, how many baskets of scraps were left over?
12.
And how many were left when I fed the 4,000 with 7 rounds?
7.
And still you don't understand.
When they came into Bethsaida, a group brought a blind man to Jesus, and they begged him to touch the man and heal him. So Jesus guided the man out of the village, away from the crowd, and he spat on the man's eyes and touched them.
What do you see?
I see people, but they look like trees, walking trees.
Jesus touched his eyes again, and when the man looked up, he could see everything clearly. Jesus sent him away to his house.
Don't go into town yet, and don't tell anybody in town what happened here.
Here ends our reading of the Gospel.